Farm Place is a residential rehabilitation clinic set in the Surrey countryside near the market town of Dorking, roughly an hour south of London. In 1996, it was where people of a certain income and a certain social position went to address the kind of problems that didn't circulate in the newspapers they were accustomed to reading about: alcohol, prescription dependency, the slow overlap between the two that arrives quietly over months until it isn't quiet anymore. Dale Tryon, Baroness Tryon, 48 years old, platinum-blond, born Dale Harper in Melbourne in 1948, had checked herself in after cancer treatment in 1993 had introduced her to painkillers she found, in the aftermath of the cancer itself, impossible to put down. The vodka and champagne had come later, and they had compounded rather than helped. At some point during her stay at Farm Place, she fell from a window. The floor she fell from depends on which account you consult. The Independent, reporting her death in November 1997, described a first-floor window. The Daily Record, a 2008 Channel 4 documentary, and several tabloid features compiled in subsequent years say the third floor, roughly 8 meters, approximately 25 feet. The injuries aren't disputed. A shattered spine, severe enough to end her ability to walk, left her paraplegic for the remaining 18 months of her life. The Independent's obituary confirms she had been in a wheelchair for the past 18 months at the time of her death, which places the fall squarely in 1996. A fractured skull appears in one documentary source. The press obituaries focus on the spinal injury without mentioning the skull. From her hospital bed, she reportedly told her son, Charles Tryon, her second child, the boy who had been named for the Prince of Wales and whose godfather the prince had agreed to be in 1976, that she had not jumped, that she had been pushed. She allegedly told friends, by later accounts, that someone was trying to kill her. These are her own reported claims, and their standing in the evidential record needs to be established plainly at the outset. No named broadcast interview in which she made these statements on camera has been identified. The claim reaches us through a 2008 Channel 4 documentary called Prince Charles's Other Mistress, and through the tabloid features that followed it, reported speech assembled at a distance, conveying what friends and family say she said. Her family consistently denied any suggestion of deliberate harm. Anthony Tryon, her husband, had her sectioned under the Mental Health Act for 28 days following the fall. The coroner's inquest reportedly returned an open verdict. The court didn't formally classify the incident as suicide, accident, or anything else. An open verdict is the law's acknowledgement that the evidence doesn't support a conclusion. It's also, in this case, the most accurate description of what the public record contains about that window. Viewers who have followed Dale Tryon's story, and the channel's earlier coverage produced more comment section demand about her than almost any other subject in this space, have consistently pointed to one detail as the linchpin. 9 likes, from a viewer who stated it clearly. She had an absolute fear of heights, and a woman with that fear wouldn't choose a window. The detail circulates widely online and appears in documentary commentary about her. Traced back to a named source, it can't be found in any biography, any named friend's statement, or any obituary. It originates in anonymous commentary, without attribution. This does not mean it's untrue. It means it can't be stated as biographical fact. If it's true, it complicates the official account significantly. Her own claim that she was pushed, which survives as reported speech through multiple later sources, stands without it. Where the record is clearer, and considerably more disturbing, is everywhere else. She was born on 3rd of January 1948 in Melbourne, the eldest of 3 children of Barry Harper, who had made his money in printing. The Harper family was prosperous by post-war Australian standards, well-resourced, well-connected to the professional class that ran things, the kind of family whose eldest daughter understood from an early age that options existed. She was the firstborn, and by every account, she arrived carrying an outsized share of energy and will. In early childhood, she was diagnosed with Perthes disease, a condition where blood supply to the femoral head is disrupted, leaving the hip joint vulnerable during the years when the bone most needs to be held in correct alignment. She was also diagnosed separately with spina bifida, a congenital condition of the spine present from birth that would stay with her, at varying severity, for the rest of her life. The treatment for Perthes disease in 1950s Melbourne meant extended periods at a children's hospital and orthopedic immobilization, what Wikipedia, drawing on the biographical record, describes as time spent in irons, from feet to chest. The Independent's obituary records the duration. She was paralyzed until the age of 9. 9 years old. 9 years of watching a room rather than moving through it, of measuring the world by what could be seen from a hospital bed, of learning social intelligence the way people learn it when physical freedom isn't available, by attention, by memory, by the precision that comes from having nothing else to do. The hospital's name hasn't survived in accessible sources. Specific photographs of her from this period haven't been identified in any public archive. What has survived is the consequence. Every biographical account of her adult life reaches for the same vocabulary. Sally Bedell Smith, in her 2017 biography of Prince Charles, calls her the vivacious blonde daughter at their first documented meeting. Tina Brown's 2022 account in The Palace Papers describes her as a platinum-blond Australian with luscious lips. The Royal Forums thread started in 2005 by members who remembered the coverage of her death, recalled her as someone who once had tremendous joie de vivre. These accounts span 3 decades and different kinds of writers, and they are pointing at the same person. The word vivacious is doing considerable work in all of them, and what it's describing is the force that accumulates in a child who has been held still for 9 years. In the late 1960s, before she left Australia, Dale Harper worked as a reporter for the Australian Women's Weekly, the highest circulation magazine in the country, a weekly publication that reached more Australian households than any newspaper. The journalism was society-oriented and feature-driven. Events, personalities, the world of access rather than investigation. But the trade she learned wasn't particular to the genre. She learned how information is valued. She learned that the relationship between a journalist and a source resembles friendship without being friendship, that both parties are calculating, continuously, what the access is worth and what it costs. She learned what she was worth as a source. She learned what sources were worth to her. In approximately 1972, she moved to London, and within 2 weeks of entering the upper-end social circuit, by one account, possibly the most compressed piece of social velocity in this entire story, she had met Anthony Tryon, 3rd Baron Tryon. The speed of it's worth noting. She was someone who knew how to enter a room and identify quickly who the significant people in it were. The Tryon family's proximity to the crown wasn't social or ceremonial. It was financial and structural. Anthony's father, Charles Tryon, 2nd Baron Tryon, had served as keeper of the privy purse and treasurer to the Queen from 1952 to 1971. 19 years as the person responsible for managing the financial affairs of the monarch herself. Anthony had grown up as a page of honor in a household that had managed the crown's money for decades. The family seat was the manor house at Great Durnford, near Salisbury in Wiltshire. Prince Charles had almost certainly known Anthony Tryon since childhood, the son of the man who kept his mother's accounts. The Sydney Morning Herald, in Anthony's 2019 obituary, records that he flew to Melbourne to seek Barry Harper's permission to marry Dale. The formal engagement? The man who travels to Australia to ask the father, then returns with the answer. Whatever happened later in the Tryon marriage, it began with this precise, ceremonious gesture. They married on 13 April 1973 at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace, London. The venue required royal permission to use. The wedding, in other words, was ratified at a site inside the palace complex. Dale Harper had entered Britain through its largest possible door, by one of the most orthodox available routes: aristocratic marriage, royal chapel, family with 2 decades of royal household service. She had not slipped in through the back. She had walked through the front, with the door held open. They had 4 children: Zoe in 1974, Charles in 1976, and twins Edward and Victoria in 1979. The second child's name wasn't coincidental. Prince Charles agreed to serve as godfather, confirmed in Nigel Dempster's account of the social world of that period. The Tryons and Charles fished together in Iceland. The biography Queen and Die confirms him in Iceland with Lord Tryon and his wife Kanga, with whom he had been friends for years. They were at the same country gatherings, the same charity events, the same polo matches and fishing trips through the 1970s and well into the 1980s. She had met him separately years before. The Independent's obituary records a dance in Melbourne in 1966, when she was 16 and he was 18, attending the Timbertop campus of Geelong Grammar School during his year in Australia. He remembered her. The friendship that deepened through the Tryon marriage had its roots in that earlier meeting. 2 young people from opposite ends of the earth, at a dance in Victoria, before either of them was who they would become. Somewhere in this period, the line entered circulation. It appeared in her 1997 obituaries as direct speech that Prince Charles had described Dale Tryon as the only woman who really understands me. The Independent cited it the day after her death. The Scottish Daily Express and the Daily Express both ran versions of it. Multiple subsequent accounts, from authorized biographies to tabloid retrospectives, picked it up and repeated it, and repetition acquired the authority of corroboration. The sourcing, examined carefully, is considerably less certain than the number of repetitions implies. Tina Brown, in the Palace Papers, put it in quite different terms. Dale, Brown wrote, had put it about that Charles was said to have declared this. Fox News, covering the story after Charles's coronation in 2023, noted that some reports alleged that statement may have come from Tryon herself. The exact wording varies from source to source. Understands me, understood him, ever understood him, which is consistent with a line that has been paraphrased through social circulation rather than transcribed from a primary source. No passage containing this line has been found in Jonathan Dimbleby's 1994 authorized biography of the Prince of Wales, which is the closest existing document to a primary record of Charles's emotional life during the period in question. What this means for the record: the line is widely documented as a description of their relationship. It can't be confirmed as Charles's own direct words in a primary or authoritative source. It may be something he said privately that a friend passed on. It may be something Dale said he had said, which circulated until it acquired the weight of direct quotation. Tina Brown's framing, that Dale encouraged its circulation, points toward the latter, at least in part. What the line reveals, regardless of its precise origin, is something about the transaction Dale was engaged in throughout this period. She understood how information moves. She had been trained in how sources benefit from the stories that circulate about them. She was borrowing authority from someone else's words, and she was doing it in a world where the original speaker had every institutional reason to want the borrowing to stop. The palace understood this. It would later act on that understanding. In 1983, 10 years after her marriage, Dale launched the Kanga label. The boutique was at Beauchamp Place, Knightsbridge, one of the most fashionable streets in London, the kind of address that announced commercial seriousness rather than social aspiration. A photo archive record dated 6 July 1983 shows her there as Lady Dale Elizabeth Tryon, fashion designer, owner of fashion boutique called Kanga. By the mid-1980s, the label was in shops in England, America, Australia, France, and Spain. Later branches opened in Salisbury, Hong Kong, and Dublin. Anthology magazine records that she headhunted Don O'Neill, a named fashion designer, to work with the label, evidence of an enterprise professional enough to recruit senior talent. The clothes themselves were feminine, occasion-appropriate, the aesthetic of a certain kind of 1980s London social life, what one fashion writer called frothy frocks, which understates them without being entirely wrong. She had created the label, and she built it from Beauchamp Place outward until it was selling on 4 continents. This wasn't an aristocratic hobby, it was a business. The defining moment of the label's public credibility came on 13 July 1985. Princess Diana wore a kanga dress to the Live Aid concert at Wembley Stadium, watched by an estimated 1.5 billion television viewers worldwide. Multiple sources confirm this: Wikipedia, the Daily Record, the Scottish Daily Express, the Royal Observer. Diana wore the label again in a series of photographs at Kensington Palace later that year, and again during a Florida polo visit. The strategic dimension behind the endorsement is documented in the 2008 Channel 4 documentary, in which royal expert Christopher Wilson described the dynamic. Camilla was the enemy, and on the basis that my enemy's enemy is my friend, Diana could see that there was some purpose in having an alliance with Dale. The Live Aid dress was a political gesture as much as a fashion choice, Diana making a statement about whose side she was on, in the quiet language of clothing that both women understood. The Tryon family had always denied any romantic component to the relationship between Dale and Charles. The Kanga label and the Live Aid photograph gave Dale something the family denials couldn't undermine: a professional identity built entirely on her own work. She wasn't only the woman who knew Charles, she was the designer whose dresses the Princess of Wales wore in public. Whatever happened to the friendship, the label was hers alone. In 1993, the compounding began. She was diagnosed with uterine cancer. Surgery and medication followed. The painkillers prescribed during treatment introduced a chemical dependency into a body already managing congenital spinal issues and the residual consequences of childhood Perthes disease. The hip that had been held in irons until she was 9 had given her decades of managing chronic pain. The cancer was eventually beaten. The painkiller dependency wasn't. Vodka and champagne, in quantities that multiple sources describe as excessive, became part of the picture in the aftermath of treatment. By 1996, Farm Place was the destination. Meanwhile, the landscape of what she had been closest to had already shifted in ways that the social calendar couldn't fully conceal. On 29 June 1994, 2 years into Dale's cancer treatment, ITV broadcast Charles, the Private Man, the Public Role, the Jonathan Dimbleby documentary watched by millions of people on the night it aired. Dimbleby asked Charles whether he had been faithful and honorable in his marriage. Charles replied, "Yes, absolutely." Pressed, "Yes, until it became irretrievably broken down, us both having tried." The following day, Richard Aylard, Charles's private secretary, confirmed at a press conference that the woman in question was Camilla Parker Bowles. In the documentary, Charles had referred to Camilla as a dear friend and a great friend of mine, one of a large number of friends. That phrase, a large number of friends, was doing specific institutional work. Once the primary narrative had been confirmed and formalized, the secondary characters required management. The large number of friends was the taxonomy. Every woman who had been close, every relationship that might complicate the singular story now being assembled, was filed under it. Dale was in that file. She had been in it functionally for some time before the documentary made it official. She had continued to give interviews through this period, maintaining her public presence, her visibility in the social world adjacent to the palace, her willingness to be documented with Charles at events. She had not been silent about what she knew or what she had meant. Warren, an Australian Royal Forums administrator who followed her coverage in Australian media, noted in 2005 that toward the end, she began making statements about her relationship with Charles, seemingly designed to reinforce her perceived role as a central figure in his life. This was a woman trained in the mechanics of press coverage, using what she had left. It was also the thing that made her exile, from the palace's perspective, a matter of necessity rather than preference. Return now to Farm Place in 1996, with more of the record visible. She was 48 years old, in a rehabilitation clinic after cancer treatment, managing a marriage that was cooling toward its formal end, in possession of 23 years of proximity to the heir to the British throne, and the professional background to know exactly what that proximity was worth if she chose to use it. The sources dispute the floor she fell from. The sources agree on what happened to her body. From her hospital bed, "I didn't jump, I was pushed." Reported through documentary accounts. "Someone is trying to kill me." Reported through the same route. These are her claims. The open verdict from the coroner's inquest is the court's formal acknowledgement that neither the official account nor Dale's account could be established as conclusive. The two aren't equal in what they claim. The official account describes a woman in severe mental health crisis whose husband had her sectioned, falling or throwing herself from a window. Her own account, as reported by others, describes something done to her. Both can be present in the record simultaneously, and neither can be resolved from the public record. The discipline required here isn't to choose. The audience's instinct, shaped by the 20-like comment on the channel's earlier coverage, "Who would benefit most from Kanga's death?" is understandable. The question does not have an answer that the evidence supports. What it has is a context. A woman who knew too much, who had talked, who was showing signs of instability at a moment when the palace's primary narrative was being carefully consolidated, died at 49 without any formal explanation of what happened at that window. That context is more disturbing than any specific answer would be. Specific answers close down. This stays open. The documented cooling of Dale's relationship with Charles belongs to the 1990s, not to any earlier decade. She remained a visible presence in the royal social world through the 1980s. Iceland fly fishing, various documented occasions across that period. The friendship didn't end dramatically. It was reclassified, by degrees, which is the more efficient institutional method and the one least likely to produce a public break that generates a public story. Tina Brown's account in The Palace Papers provides the sharpest documentation of the final phase. Dale, in her wheelchair in 1997, frantically pursued Charles at a polo match. Brown writes that Charles subsequently issued a chilly statement saying they were no longer the friends they once were. Wikipedia, citing Brown, records the specific framing. He was in touch with Dale only once or twice a year, and they were no longer the closer friends they had once been. This statement was released while Dale was terminally ill, in a wheelchair, having lost her marriage. The Scottish Daily Express summarized the arc as, "Lady Tryon and the then Prince of Wales grew apart in later years as her marriage broke down, although they remained in touch." Accurate, as a description, but what it describes as drifting is more precisely a controlled reduction, performed when having the record accurate mattered more than the cost of the accuracy. She had worked in journalism. She understood how information moves. The palace understood this too. A woman trained in how sources operate, who had maintained a public presence and a social circulation of the most important story in her life, who was showing signs of significant instability in 1996 and 1997. This wasn't someone the institution could afford to have close when it was consolidating its most important narrative. The management of that risk didn't require a single decision. It required a pattern of decisions made over time by an institution that works slowly and works well. The statement, once or twice a year, was the formal record of that pattern's completion. In the summer of 1980, a decade before the diamond ball photographs, a different woman had encountered the same institutional logic by a more direct route. Anna Wallace had been a serious companion for Charles through 1979 and into 1980. At the Queen Mother's 80th birthday ball at Windsor Castle, Charles spent the evening dancing with Camilla Parker Bowles. Wallace waited. She didn't wait long. The version of her departure that appears in multiple biographies, the precise wording varies between Penny Junor's account and others, but the substance is consistent, was direct enough. "No one treats me like that, not even you." She left the ball. She married John Fermer Hesketh on 2 December 1980, less than 6 months later. Wallace saw the terms of the arrangement and declined them in the same motion. She was 25 when she walked out. She left before the reclassification could be completed, which meant she left on her own terms rather than the institution's. Dale Tryon stayed. She had married into the family, built a label, raised 4 children at Great Durnford in Wiltshire, attended the Iceland fishing trips and the London charity events and the polo matches. She stayed for more than 2 decades. Her exit wasn't chosen. It was arranged for her, by degrees, by people who understood that controlled reduction is cleaner than confrontation and produces less that needs to be addressed in statements. The pattern across the women in this orbit during this period isn't conspiracy. It's consistent institutional logic. Women who understood Charles early, who got close enough to see how he functioned and what he was when the public surface was down, eventually encountered the same wall. The ones who walked found it once, dramatically, and left. The ones who stayed found it again and again, at lower velocity, until they had been moved far enough back that the distance was presentable. Anna Wallace was expelled in one evening, cleanly enough that she chose her own exit. Dale Tryon was reclassified over 24 years, until she was no longer the woman who really understood him, but an acquaintance contacted once or twice a year. No longer a baroness, but Dale Harper. No longer someone the palace needed to manage, but someone it had already managed into silence and distance. The divorce decree nisi was granted on 1 September 1997. Princess Diana had died in Paris the night before. These 2 facts are documented record, not interpretation. Diana died on 31 August 1997. The Tryon decree became official on 1 September. They share a calendar day, and nothing else. The only thread connecting them is the figure of the same man at the center of both their stories. Dale spent her final weeks in motion. A trip to Australia to see her mother, a journey to India for homeopathic spinal treatment, reportedly arranged through a doctor Charles had introduced. When she returned to London, she was admitted to King Edward VII's Hospital in Westminster. The bed sores that had developed from her paraplegia had become infected. The infection became septicemia, blood poisoning, the cause of death listed on every official record. She died on 15 November 1997. She was 49 years old. Her estate, approximately £1.3 million, went to her 4 children. She had dropped the title by then, reverting to Dale Harper, the name she had arrived in London with in the early 1970s. 76 days had passed since Diana died, just over 2.5 months. One death produced a week of national mourning, a constitutional crisis about the monarchy's relationship with its public, a funeral watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide. The other produced an obituary in The Independent, noting that she had been in a wheelchair for 18 months and that she left her estate to her children. A comment on the channel's earlier coverage, earning 12 likes from viewers who felt the comparison needed direct statement, read, "Death took the wrong woman." The observation is emotionally driven and contains something the record does not contradict, an asymmetry so complete that it seemed to require naming. The comparison honors both women, or it honors neither. What it captures is the structural reality that proximity to this particular man came with no guarantees of proportion, in life or in death. The file on Dale Tryon does not close on a verdict. It wasn't designed to. The window question, what happened at Farm Place in 1996, whether it was accident, self-harm, or something else, sits in the same permanent uncertainty as the origin of the line she carried through her adult life, and as the precise mechanism by which the friendship she had built over 2 decades was reduced to a chilly statement about once or twice a year. These are things the public record does not settle. The open verdict isn't a judicial failure. It's the record being honest about what the evidence contains. What the record does settle is the shape of a pattern, running consistently enough through documented fact to be stated as pattern rather than theory. There is a small girl in a Melbourne hospital, held still by orthopedic bracing while the bone heals correctly, waiting for the day the stillness can end. There is a woman in a wheelchair at a Surrey polo ground, trying to reach someone who had already issued the statement that ended the conversation. Between those two stillnesses, the child held by metal, the woman held by the consequences of a window in Surrey, she had run further and faster than almost any woman of her generation. Out of Melbourne, into London, into the confidence of the future king. She built a fashion label that sold its dresses on 4 continents. She persuaded Princess Diana to wear her designs in front of the largest television audience in history. She survived cancer. She didn't survive what came after the fall. She told the truth as she saw it. About who she had been to someone important, about what had happened at a window in 1996. In a world where the people who know the rules never speak, and the people who speak never stay. The question the title asks is the one the record can't answer. The question the record can answer is colder. Who benefited from her silence, and what it cost her not to provide it?